Hello and welcome back to the Blush Studio. I am so excited to take this drawing that we did in a previous video and paint it with watercolor. It is a green butterfly, so I will be using a lot of different green tones, but I'll also be mixing in some other tones in here as well. As I'm mixing the colors together, the color names will pop at the bottom of the screen. I'll also have them listed down below. I'm pretty much going to be using sap green and yellow ochre, but for the majority of the body of the butterfly, I'll be using sap green almost exclusively, and then I'll just kind of pop in some other colors there. Basically what we're going to do is I'm going to just go through the process with you and show you how I'm creating this watercolor version of this butterfly. If you'd like to see and hear some of my tips on drawing this exact butterfly, or really drawing butterflies in general, I'll have that video linked down below. So you won't want to miss that one, especially if you struggle kind of with drawing from life or drawing from a photograph. I'll also have the reference photo listed down below. So now mostly what I'm doing is I'm just mixing up a couple of different options of the same color. So I like to start with kind of a main body color, which in this case is sap green, which you can see I'm pulling more sap green from. But I know I'm going to want to add some more yellow tones in there, so I'm mixing that with my yellow ochre just to kind of get a nice balance in there. So the color leans towards that yellow, but it isn't like super obnoxious. And then I did the same thing with the blue, so I added a little bit of that blue in with the sap green so that it had a lot of the blue undertone with it without being overpowering. And that's just something that I like to do. I like to work with a limited color palette and really have that harmony throughout all the colors that I'm working with. Now I have a very detailed illustration, but before I start painting, I'm going to actually lighten my pencil lines with my kneaded eraser. And this is great for erasing things, but without losing all of my reference lines. So I'm still able to get that nice, realistic painting and the guide that I've already created and worked so hard on without kind of overpowering the piece. So I don't want you to be able to see the pencil through my painting. The reason I would use a kneaded eraser for this instead of like a regular white eraser would get rid of most, if not all, of my lines, where a kneaded eraser is just a much softer approach. So now that that's lightened up quite a bit, I'm going to zoom you in and we'll start painting. Okay, as I mentioned before, I'm mostly going to be using sap green as my base. That really ended up being the perfect color, the perfect shade for working with this butterfly. And what I'm doing right now is I'm adding my first pass, or like my wash, down. And what I do is really, it's could really be best described as dirty water. And I'm just really applying that first baseline of color down and establishing the values a little bit. So I'm making sure that my water goes all the way to the edge, and then I'm tapping in a little bit of extra color where I want it to be built up. And for me, I've decided I really want it to be kind of on the tips as well as on the inside. I usually do the inside towards the body of the butterfly, allow that to be darker just to kind of keep drawing the eye towards that section. Now I'm going to take a little bit of the yellow ochre and I'm going to drop it in, and this will allow it to, while it's still wet, allow it to mix very organically. I ended up grabbing some of this lemon yellow hue as well, just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. I just felt like the yellow ochre was a little bit too ruddy and a little too orange, but I definitely wanted it to still be the main body of the color. You'll see I can just kind of keep adding that in there and it will blend really nicely. That's the advantage of working wet on wet, where if it was dry, you would kind of see the lines between where things are blending. It wouldn't have this soft edge, which is really what I'm going for the first pass. I really want this to be have a very watercolor feel and be very soft. And then I'm just going to repeat the same thing on the other side. So I have a little bit of pigment and a lot of water on my brush. So I even went back, got a little bit more water. I'm just going to the very edge of this wing. And once I have that all filled in with just my dirty water, I'm going to go in and continue to add a little bit more green. Now you don't want this to be soaking wet. then you're going to end up with problems with the mixing and your water will pool. This is kind of what you're going for. So see how like the surface of my paper is wet, but it's not soaking wet. You can see it's allowing everything to dry nicely. Even a section of this is drying now, but I could still go in and start to add a little bit more color in there if I needed to. Just repeating the process, a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of that lemon yellow, and just kind of adding a little bit of depth and dimension. You can see that the right side is already drying a little bit, and how it's just like a really soft kind of a blend in there. I really like how that turned out. I was very proud of myself for that one. Now that it's dry, I'm going to start on the second half, and I'm really just going to try and repeat some of this process, but instead of having quite as much of the yellow ochre, I'm going to add in some of that blue. Now, to respect your time, I've sped this process up a little bit because I'm really just repeating what I did on the top, and I'm going to do the same thing for that third wing in the middle, where I'm just kind of applying the dirty water, but then while it's still wet, I'm adding in another color. So here it's a little bit of this blue-green tone. I really want to try and pull the blues in there. And I'm going to deepen up the interior section of the wings as well to make sure that it's the intensity that I want it to be. I like that it has like this nice soft watercolor look, but I don't want it to be too desaturated. So that's why I kind of keep building it up and building it up. Did the same thing to the other side, and now I'm switching to my number 4 size round, and we're going to start in on some of the details. I'm using my favorite black, which is a Daniel Smith color. I'll have it linked down below as well. Mixing it with some green just to, again, kind of tie everything together, but also it's kind of a warmer black if you mix it with another color. And I'm going to just work on some of these details while I wait for that lower section to dry. And you'll see that I'm kind of bouncing around quite a bit with this painting. And that's just to allow different sections of the painting to dry. You can use like a hair dryer or something like that, but I never do that. In my head, I don't want the water to, or the color, the pigment to move at all. And I'd rather just be patient than try and rush anything. But I know a lot of artists who have really good luck with using a hair dryer or something similar to dry their painting in between their passes. But for me, I'd rather just kind of move on, do something else for a little while, and then come back once everything is dried the way I want it to be. Now this is one of the first times I'm using this number 4 brush. I really struggled with it. I'm not really sure why exactly, but I'll actually be switching brushes in a little while because I just really couldn't get the detail that I wanted. I couldn't get the tip to be quite as sharp as I wanted to be. So a couple times on my palette, you'll see that I kind of twist the brush in the pigment, and that is just me trying to get that tip nice and sharp. And I really haven't had any trouble with these brushes in the past. But for some reason this time around, I just really struggled with the number 4. I am going to be like testing it out a little bit. I'm assuming it's just a fluke because again, I have a bunch of these brushes in different sizes, and I've never had any problem with them. But if you do kind of struggle with getting your tip nice and straight, try twisting it a little bit before you apply it to your paper, and that will help the point to straighten out a little bit, in theory. So here you can see I'm just building up the intensity of the body itself. I started with just kind of that light wash, and I'm going around with the detail brush on the edges to kind of create a modeling effect. This is what I do if I'm shading a butterfly, whether it's in pencil or with watercolor, but it helps by adding the darker area to the side and having kind of that highlight in the middle. That will help to make it look and appear to be round and a little bit more three-dimensional. So I'll go back in and I'll kind of build up the intensity throughout the painting, but that's usually how I like to start. Now I'm going to repeat our process again, but this will be for the center wing. And one of the main reasons I really want this, both sections on top and bottom, to dry before I go in on that middle section is because I want it to overlap. I really want to take advantage of this overlap and have the intensity and kind of the semi-transparent look really shown off in this piece. So I'm going to kind of deepen the outside and then this section that overlaps to make sure that it's really obvious. And then I'm going to go in and start kind of adding in some of the more fun colors. And I'll do this with both sides, and you can see that it has just this beautiful semi-transparent overlapping look, and it's a really easy effect to get. You just have to be patient enough to allow each layer to dry and to dry really well so that none of the pigment is being moved around when you add the next layer on. And you do want to work fast. You don't want to like be massaging the paint that's already dried underneath. And you can see here now that it's dried, it has this beautiful semi-transparent effect where you can see each of the three wings standing on their own, but you can see them through the next piece as well. And I just love that. That was one thing that really drew me to this butterfly and is the reason that I ended up painting it, along with kind of the three wings section. I really thought that that was super fun. So like I said before, I will be continuing to build up the intensity on the body. You can see I'm doing that now, just making it darker, but allowing that center section to stay as a highlight to help give the effect of, that modeling, that 3D effect. And that's just a simple trick to help the body, normally rather boring body, if you've seen this reference image, help it to look more alive and just give it a little bit more depth and dimension. And now it's time to get started on the fun part. We're going to start adding the details for the wings themselves. Now, as I like to do for really all of my butterfly paintings, at least so far, is I'm going to start with kind of an exterior edge piece. And this is a piece that there's not a lot of detail to it. It's just pretty straightforward. So this piece is a line that is pretty consistent throughout the whole edge of the wing. It's a little bit thicker towards the interior, towards the body, but it doesn't require a lot of thinking. And then off of that, I'm going to start adding in these other details. Now with this butterfly, I tried a slightly different technique that I'm really excited to show you. In the past, I've painted the whole line, and I really work with it like a massaging technique to kind of soften the edge. And while that works, I wanted to test out something that was a little bit more sophisticated, if you will, that required a little bit less of just the aggravating the paper. I really wanted to keep the quality of my paper in check and just try something a little bit different. So I'm still using, here we go, I switched to the round brush number 2 because I was just having trouble still with that number 4 like I mentioned earlier. So I'm just kind of going in and I'm softening everything. And for this outside edge, I am going to be painting every single line. You'll see I added a little bit more of the sap green to that darker color because I felt like it was a little bit too punchy for these detail pieces. So I want it to be dark enough, obviously, to see, but I don't want it to be such a high contrast. And I'm going to zoom you in here so you can see a little bit more of what I'm doing in just a moment. Now you can see how I'm following each line. And I'm just going slowly with this detail brush. And every time I go back for more pigment, I'm going to spin my brush in the pigment to make sure that the tip is nice and sharp. Then I will connect it with this other section. And unfortunately, I didn't wait long enough to allow that middle wing section to dry, so you can see my paint starts to run. So I end up having to pick that up, wipe it off on a towel, pick it up again, wipe it off on a towel, and then go back in and try and kind of save this section. Thankfully, the areas that the pigment bled was kind of a soft gradient anyway, so I didn't cause a lot of damage, but I definitely should have been more patient and just waited before kind of diving into some of this. Okay, so this is where I'm doing things a little bit differently this time. So I'm looking for the junctions of the veins, and I'm painting those in, making sure they're nice and dark, not too dark. I'm still using like a lot of the green in there with that black color, and I'm really just tapping a little bit of color there and allowing it to fade towards the next junction, so towards the next corner. So the lines are very, very minimal, but kind of those the corners, I'm not really sure how else to explain it. The corners of these veins where they come together, those are nice and dark. And so instead of before where I would like massage the paper to get that to be a little bit softer, I decided to try this technique and just experiment with it. I didn't want to have to kind of be aggressive on my brushes or mess with the paper So I decided to try this technique now that I have more of a detail brush, and I really like the way it turned out. It still has kind of the softness. There's the lines are implied more than actually there, and it was actually a little bit faster, so that was kind of nice as well. So you can see how I'm drawing this line out. I'm kind of pulling it, but I don't really have my brush pressed to the paper the entire time. As I'm pulling it across towards the next point, I'm also slowly picking it up, off of the paper. And you'll see I go over it a couple of times just to make sure that the transition is nice and soft. So see that section there? That got a little bit messy. And I had to kind of go over with my brush. That's what I used to do for my butterflies in the past. That's what I have done, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but I just wanted to try something that was a little bit more sophisticated, I guess is the only way I can think of it. The blending technique that I used before wasn't bad, but it was kind of aggressive on my brushes and kind of compromised the quality of the paper because it would pill if I had to massage it too much, if I had waited too long. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can see that technique kind of in action for a lot of my other butterfly tutorials. I have a whole playlist of just different techniques that we're experimenting with to try and capture the beauty of these butterflies. And I've just really enjoyed this whole process of just experimenting. The great thing about butterflies being kind of a smaller subject, but also having so much detail, is that it's a great way to experiment with painting. And just trying different techniques. So that's what I'm doing with this one, and I actually really like how it turned out. I'll probably try this technique again. So for this section, I'm really relying heavily on my reference photo. It's a lot harder to see the guidelines that I created for certain sections, definitely on that bottom wing of kind of the three-wing section. I really couldn't see what was going on, and I really struggled to follow my pencil lines. So thankfully, that's why we keep a good reference photo handy. I was able to work completely off of that reference photo. And I'm just continuing to build up the pigment. Now that this section has dried, I can go over it and actually add the lines in that I was trying to add in before. And just continuing to build that in. Now, some of the section I want to be very soft, and so I'm going to add a little bit more water and have a little bit less pigment and just slowly blend that in. So I have kind of like an interior section that I'm working on, and then I pick up some pigment and kind of slowly blend it out, and that helps me to just kind of control it. I'm going really slowly, so I'm adding some water, basically some dirty water like we did with the first pass, and then I'll add kind of some pigment to it and then allow it to blend towards the edge of that water that I just placed down. Okay, so right here I'm taking just a little bit of the green and kind of defining that edge. I would like it to be a little bit sharper than it ended up being, and then adding a little bit more of the darker tone and pulling that out. Just can help define that. Back to my number 4 because I'm crazy. I don't know. It didn't really work for me the whole time. I think I end up going back to the 2, but I did have a lot of this dark section to fill in, so I didn't want to have to try and keep the section that I'm doing wet by using a detail brush. So I'm going to try and keep this whole section that I'm working on nice and damp, just like we did with the first wing, and that's because I want to be able to continue to drop more pigment in here to help build up the intensity that I need. So you'll see I'll go kind of to the exterior, but then I'll kind of drop some more water in just to keep it nice and wet. So here I am adding some nice wet pigment. So it's not soaked, it's not super saturated, but I want it to be damp enough that it's going to stay wet while I keep adding this pigment so it has a nice even blend. I want it to have a good even fade as it goes towards the interior of the wing itself. So I'm still able to kind of mess with the edge and pull that up and kind of map out where everything is going. But because it's nice and damp, it's not going to kind of create any lines, any harsh lines, or any of the bloom effects. And that is, so blooming with watercolor is when it kind of gets that cloudy edge. See, it's nice and damp. And I'm just blending it with this section that's still a little bit wet. And then I'm going to go in and drop in a lot of pigment. Because again, I want it to be nice and dark and saturated towards the edge, but as it goes towards the interior, I want it to fade. Not too much, I still want to be able to capture these different points, but I want it to be much softer, and that'll give me a little bit more time to manipulate it. Like I believe I mentioned before, I wasn't able to see my reference lines as well. I just erased too much or added too much paint or something. Who knows what happened, it doesn't really matter. So I'm really I'm relying heavily on my reference image, and so that means I need to go a little bit slower. Now this section of the video is sped up a little bit, so hopefully you're not like expecting to paint quite this fast. But in order to kind of respect your time and make this a more manageable size video, I did speed it up a little bit. So see how it has that nice gradient effect from, you know, the exterior towards the interior, especially that kind of, there's that center point on the side there. That's really what I'm going for and trying to build up. Now I'm switching back to my number 2 size, of course, because that number 4 was driving me nuts. And we're going to start in on some of these details. Now I'm going to do the same thing I did at the top section, and I'm just going to really concentrate the pigment on the corners, on the junctions where these lines come together. And sometimes I will actually connect the lines, and sometimes I won't at all. And that's just, the goal is to get kind of a very soft implied look, because there's not an actual line there, even though our brains will connect it. That's the reason we call it an implied line. It will kind of give that a more soft and just gentle effect. At least that's the goal. I feel like it kind of worked, but it also kind of looks like stained glass or broken glass. I don't know. What do you think? Let me know down below. Does it look soft and gentle, or does it look more like shattered glass? I don't know. This is my shattered glass butterfly. Either way, I'm continuing to work on these lines, just following the same effect. Again, I love how butterflies are a great way to experiment with different techniques. Now, I mentioned before that I don't have a lot of reference lines placed down, so I'm really relying heavily on my reference photo, and I'm going one line at a time, and that's really all you need to do to draw anything that you want. Whether it's a flower, you go one petal, one line at a time, one shape at a time. If you're drawing a person, if you're drawing a building, everything that you're going to be drawing, you just break it down into shapes and different lines. Don't get so caught up with the trees that you or the forest, that you don't see the individual trees. That analogy didn't work at all. But I think you know what I mean. Like, don't get so caught up in the whole piece that you totally forget to break it down and just see each individual piece for what it is. So you're looking for beautiful shapes, you're looking for different connections, you're looking for relationships. And so you're kind of looking for, okay, how does this line interact with this line? And do they connect? Is there a reason that they connect? Do I want to emphasize this? Do I want to elongate that? And then just kind of go from there. So it's time to work on petal. It's time to work on wing number 3. We're going to kind of finish up this butterfly. This one doesn't have quite as much of like that dark black that the other 2 have, so it'll be much faster, and it'll be really just doing a lot of what we've already done, which is kind of adding these junction points in. So again, constantly looking at my reference photo, even if I can see my reference lines that I've already drawn, I want to take the time to make sure that they're correct. because sometimes my drawings aren't, a lot of times my drawings aren't, you know, a perfect example of what I'm trying to paint. And so I'll reassess here, you know, do I want this to be a little bit longer? Do I want it to be a little shorter? Did I completely miss something that I should have included? And stuff like that. So if you watch the drawing portion of this, which again I'll have linked down below, you know that I like to kind of build off of a center shape that is in each wing. And this wing kind of has two, so these little ones that look kind of like, I don't know, slugs or something like that with really long antennae. I like to build off of those shapes and connect them to outside sections, and I find that that's really helpful for me, is to have kind of that one long shape that I use as my base, and I always come back to that, and then I connect it to other pieces that are coming together. Okay, now I'm going to start applying the one section that is dark. It's not quite as intense as the piece above and below it. So I'm adding kind of just that wash of dirty water, and then I'm going to, just like we were doing before, build up the intensity with by kind of plopping some pigment in there. So yeah, I'm adding that in, but because there's water there, it'll have a nice soft edge rather than a really harsh edge. Adding in some of the lines very, very softly. So this is mostly water, just a little bit of pigment, but it's not a lot of either. Just so I can have, you can kind of see the lines for this section through the wing on top of it. Now what I'm doing is I'm going through actually with a little bit of lemon yellow and yellow ochre kind of mixed together, very, very lightly. And I'm just adding this to the tips a little bit, just to add a little bit of a pop, a little bit of something special to kind of help show off these edges. And I'm just kind of doing it in these corners to intensify that color, because I feel like it faded a little bit more than I wanted it to. And I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom, but with the blue. So here I'm not really following my reference photo as much, I'm just really kind of going more instinctively off of color. So if I want a little bit more of that yellow intensity, I'm going to add it in as a slight wash. I like using it on the corners because it helps to kind of play with the dimension and the geometry that's in these shapes. And building up the intensity here as well. Again, trying to avoid that highlight so that it looks nice and three-dimensional. I believe here I'm working still with my number 2. Looks very small, doesn't it? Yep, see, number 2. Just going through, building up the intensity. You'll see that I'll kind of soften some lines and I'll deepen some others to make sure that it's built up to where I want it to be. Watercolor fades a lot as it dries, and that can be very frustrating for new artists. So I've just found sometimes you just have to have a second pass, and it's better to just be patient than to try and build it up too quickly, because it's easy to add more pigment. It's really difficult to take pigment off, especially with watercolor. Okay, so again here I'm just building up the intensity where I, looking at my reference photo, stepping back a little bit from the painting itself and seeing, okay, what's kind of disappearing, what do I need to pop, if you will, just to build up some of that intensity, build up some depth or some shadows. And so like right here I'm noticing, okay, this section kind of disappears, so I'm taking just a very dark wash or very light amount of that dark green and just kind of adding it to the under section in order to kind of build that up a little bit. Now I'm taking the blue and I'm just taking some of that pure blue pigment and I'm adding it to this section. It kind of gives it a stained glass look, and I'm following some of these lines a little bit. Again, that will help with the implied line that we were adding before, and just kind of working with. But it also adds a little bit of dimension, a little bit of personality to this butterfly. By adding a little bit of the blue that we find in the lower hand section, it'll kind of unite the whole painting together, while also, again, kind of creating that implied line, emphasizing that, and just kind of building up that intensity overall. It's a really easy and fun way to add some visual interest to your painting, and you've probably noticed that I do that with pretty much all of my butterflies. Doing the same thing with some lemon yellow here. I'm just adding that in to kind of add a little bit of variety. That is yellow ochre though. And just kind of give a little bit of depth and dimension. Just see how that has that fun, like little pop right there now. Something that was originally just kind of bland now has this extra dimension. So there is one side complete, and then we do the other side and scan it, and I did bump up the saturation on it just a little bit when I was editing it, but I'm really happy with how it turned out overall. If I wanted to go back in and kind of resaturate it like this, I'd go in with a lot of that lemon yellow to pump up the intensity of the green, but I'd really have to go in hard to get that yellow intensity the way I want it to go. I just started off with it being just a little bit too watered down. So originally when I was kind of mixing everything in with the green, I did that too much. Should have gone in with a little bit more of the pure yellow in order to get the effect that I want. I hope that you found this tutorial helpful and that you learned a lot from it. If you did, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe. There will be more butterflies in the future, as well as flowers and other types of artwork. And until next time, happy painting.